004743-001, State of Arizona versus Philip Brailsford. This is time set for preliminary hearing. Counsel, please announce.
For Your Honor, Susan Charbel on behalf of the state.
Good morning, Your Honor. Craig Mehrens with my co-counsel Amy Weilman and Philip Brailsford, and at the end is our use of force expert, Emmanuel Kappelson.
Thank you. Good morning.
Your Honor, the state will be asking for will be invoking the rule for exclusion of witnesses.
Okay. All right.
Good morning, Your Honor. Bill Richards on behalf of victims beaten for minor children. My colleague sitting in the first row there. Ms. Sweet is in the courtroom today. Next to her is our co-counsel Mark Garagos. It's a housekeeping matter. We did submit at the end of the week the completed motion to.
Good morning.
Good morning, Your Honor. Sven Budge on behalf of we're also in court with us today.
Thank you. Good morning. Counsel, before we go any further, let me just say that the court did receive 2 camera requests, one from ABC 15 News and one from the Arizona Republic. I did inform counsel of that prior to taking the bench. Did the state want to be heard?
No.
And did the defense want to be heard?
I object to the motion.
Okay. And did victims' counsel want to be heard?
Your Honor.
All right. The court has considered the request from the media and the positions of the parties. I will grant the camera requests for ABC 15 News and for the Arizona Republic. Ms. Charbel, you indicated you were invoking the rule of exclusion of witnesses.
Your Honor, I do have some proposed witnesses, and those would certainly be excluded under the rule, but it's my understanding I'm allowed to have an expert at the witness just at the counsel table, just as the state's allowed to have an investigator. So I would ask that my expert be allowed to remain at counsel table.
And remind me of his name again.
Kappelson.
Can you spell that for me?
It's Emmanuel, E-M-A-N-U-E-L, Kappelson, K-A-P-E-L-S-O-H-N.
All right. So the record should reflect that the defendant is designating Mr. Kappelson as the defendant's investigating officer. Any other business we can take care of before we proceed?
If the jury would, if the judge would just inform, because I don't know who the officers, individuals are, to make sure they're out of the courtroom if they had anything to do with the case, even just to for preliminary review.
And before the witnesses leave the courtroom, I'm just going to give you a little admonition. And Mr. Mehrens, you tell me when you're ready. I'll just ask you to tell me who you're removing from the courtroom.
Okay, I haven't met everybody else because they didn't let me interview. Anybody else on speed? That's all, Your Honor.
Judge,
Identify them for the record.
before we finish though, could I just ask that anybody who had anything to do with the case that would be on security or just got called out, anybody like that?
Why? Okay. I have Officer Jeff Jacobs, Sergeant Langley.
And just so that the clerk can get that, could you do that one more time?
I'm sorry.
For the clerk's benefit, if you could do that one more time.
Yes, sir. Sergeant Langley, Officer Jeff Jacobs, and Officer Chris Doan.
All right, so for the three of you, the rule of exclusion of witnesses has been invoked. That means that you can't be in the courtroom until you are testifying. Please don't discuss your testimony with each other or with anyone else other than counsel. And you may go ahead and exit the courtroom. Thank you. And before I forget to do it, Mr. Brailsford, could you tell me your full name and your date of birth, please?
Yes, Your Honor. It's Philip Mitchell Brailsford, December 9th, 1990.
Thank you, sir. You can have a seat. Let the record show that the defendant is present and out of custody. This is the time set for a probable cause determination. Mr. Marins, are you waiving a formal reading of the charge? Okay. The state may proceed whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. State calls Paul Sype.
Sir, if you could please come forward and approach the clerk, she will administer the oath.
Paul Sype, SIPE. I do.
And if you'll please walk around the court reporter, up the ramp, and have a seat here to my left. Ms. Charbel, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Would you tell us your name, please?
My name is Detective Paul Sype, S-I-P-E.
Who do you work for?
I'm a police officer with the City of Mesa.
All right, and you said you were a detective, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Which unit do you work with?
I work in the homicide unit.
All right, how long have you worked as a homicide detective?
2.5 years.
All right, and before that, what did you do?
I worked in organized crime for approximately 6 to 7 years. I was a member of the community action team for about 6 years, and I was in patrol prior to that.
All right, would you tell us your training and overall how many years you've been with Mesa PD and any prior law enforcement experience?
I've been a police officer for 22 years, all with the City of Mesa. I have had numerous trainings on both homicide investigation and violent crimes. I've also had trainings regarding organized crime, numerous in-service trainings, and a 20-week police academy.
I didn't hear the last sentence at the academy.
And 20 weeks at the police academy.
Thank you, Detective, thank you.
Were you on duty on January of the 18th of 2016?
I was called out for this incident, yes.
Did you, were you on call during that time? Is that how you got called out?
Yes, I was.
All right. You called out to the Quinta Inn located at 6530 East Superstition Springs Boulevard in Mesa?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that in Maricopa County?
Yes, it is.
Why was it that you were called out there?
I was called out for an officer-involved shooting at that location.
And what does that mean, an officer-involved shooting, in general terms?
In general terms, it means that an incident occurred where either an officer was shot at or an officer shot at or shot someone else.
All right, so that would be even if no one got hurt,
Correct.
to if someone was killed as a result of where an officer was involved somehow, correct?
Correct.
All right. Were you told anything on the phone when you were called about the details of the incident?
Just basically the location, where to go as far as to that location, and just a very vague reason why we were going, such as we were going for an officer-involved shooting.
Okay. Did you know at that time whether anyone had been killed or anyone was hurt or anything?
No, I did not.
All right. How are these officer-involved shooting calls assigned? Is it whichever detective's on duty from homicide, or are there detectives too involved?
Typically with an officer-involved shooting, at any given time, we have 3 detectives that are on call and 1 sergeant. So the sergeant would call out those 3 detectives. When we arrive at the scene, they would brief us on the incident. At the end of the briefing, then the homicide sergeant would then assign who was a case agent, who was responsible for the scene investigation, and any other assignments that we may need among the 3 of us.
All right. Do you recall, or have you reviewed in your report what time you arrived approximately at that location?
Yes.
What time was that?
I put that I was called out approximately, I believe, 21:30, which would be about 9:30 at night. And then I arrived within the hour of that.
All right. Do you recall what day of the week that was?
I don't recall the day of the week. It was the 18th, but I don't recall what day it was.
That's fine. What did you do first when you arrived at that location?
When I first arrived at the scene, I waited for my fellow detectives to respond and my sergeant to arrive at the scene, and then I waited for the incident briefing.
Okay, and who did the briefing? We don't need the name, but who would it have been?
One of the sergeants at the scene.
Okay. Would it have been, would it have been one of the homicide ones or one of the patrol sergeants?
No, it would have been a patrol sergeant.
Okay. And so what were you told during the briefing, again, just in general terms of what happened that night?
In general terms, just paraphrasing, we were told that officers responded to the La Quinta Inn for a subject with a gun that was pointing it out the window of the hotel. Upon arrival, they went to room 502 where they were able to contact a female and a male. We were told that during the moments when they contacted the male, that he was non-compliant, that he was put his hands behind his back several times. They stated that it was supposedly in a threatening manner, and then at some point Officer Brailsford fired, and that the victim was deceased on the 5th floor.
All right, so that would have been just during the briefing what you learned, correct?
Correct.
All right. Were you told that there was a 911 call that precipitated the response from the Mesa Police Department?
They very well may have said that it was a 911 call. That would be one of the things. Like I said, I was paraphrasing roughly what was told, but something like that would typically be in a briefing.
Okay. Now, were you told at the time, did you understand it was a gun or a rifle that was pointing out the window?
I believed it was a rifle.
Okay.
I don't recall specifically the word used, but my understanding was, or my recollection is that the term rifle was used.
Okay. And during this briefing, are you given any kind of specifics or detailed information, or is it like a 5-minute, here's what we know in general terms, and then you're assigned?
Correct. It's general terms, basically what had happened, who our witnesses are, who our victim is, who the officers involved are. It's very vague as far as that type of stuff, because then it's our responsibility to investigate it beyond that.
Okay. So who was identified as a deceased eventually that night?
Daniel Shaver,
Right. And who was identified as the shooter from the Mesa Police Department?
Philip Brailsford.
Do you see Mr. Brailsford in the courtroom today?
Yes, I do.
Would you tell us where he's sitting and what he's wearing?
You're kind of blocking him, I'm sorry. He's seated at the defense table. He's got a dark suit coat, light blue shirt, and glasses.
Your Honor, may the record reflect that the defendant has been identified.
The record will so reflect.
Now, detective, was an autopsy eventually performed on the deceased Mr. Shaver?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a copy of the medical examiner's report with you?
Yes, I do.
If I may approach, Your Honor.
You may.
Yes, I do.
I can just make sure it has all the pages in it as you recall them or having a copy of them.
It appears to contain all the pages.
First page of the autopsy report, does it show that the individual was shot and that's what killed him?
Yes, the cause of death was listed as multiple gunshot wounds.
All right. Could you tell us from looking at that front page where the shots were? All right. Can you flip through that and let us know when you've identified where those shots are?
On page 3, it's under a section, evidence of trauma.
All right, and could you tell us what those, where those shots were?
There's a full paragraph. There's also one line that's underlined, which heads each paragraph. I'm going to read the line that heads each paragraph, and then you can let me know if you want more. The first one is a gunshot wound of the back. The second paragraph is gunshot wound of the neck. The third paragraph is gunshot wound of the face. The fourth paragraph is gunshot wound of the chest. And the fifth paragraph is headed gunshot wound of the right lower extremity.
Okay. At the end of that report is our toxicology result, one pager that just
Yes.
has the results. Could
Yes,
you
there
look at
is.
that? Could you look at that, please? Sorry.
Okay.
What, if anything, is reported on there for toxicological results?
From a vitreous test, an ethyl alcohol level of 0.29, and from left chest blood, an ethyl alcohol level of 0.27.
All right. If I may approach, Your Honor.
You may. Are you moving for admission of Exhibit 1?
Detective Saib, let me take you back to the scene now. What role were you assigned at the scene?
I was assigned as case agent.
All right, what does the case agent do?
The case agent is responsible for the primary investigation of the incident.
All right, is part of your duty to collect reports from other officers or detectives or crime scene agents, anyone else that works on the case?
Yes.
All right, and were you able to also write your own report? Is that required?
Yes.
All right, did you review your report recently? All
Yes, I did.
right, and do you have a copy of it in front of you?
I think you have it, ma'am. I gave you.
Right,
my
it's
copy.
marked.
Yes.
You brought the rest of it with you?
Yes.
All right, we're going to be talking about some witnesses and what they said. Are the witnesses that we're going to discuss today, are they available and willing to testify at trial?
Yes.
All right, and you've made those contacts before you came here today, correct?
Some of them I was not able to contact, but they arrived here at court today.
Oh, okay. All right. And so you reviewed their reports and the interviews that they did in this case, correct?
Yes.
All right. So now you're at the scene and you've been briefed. What's the next thing that you do?
The first thing I did after I was briefed is I went up to the fifth floor to take a look at the scene.
Was Mr. Shaver's body still at the scene?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Is anyone allowed to touch it or move it around or deal with it at all except the medical examiner personnel?
That's correct.
All right. So as far as you knew, he was in the same position as when the officers that had originally showed up left?
That's correct.
Okay. And so did you walk up there alone?
No.
Up there with you?
Detective Rayburn went up with me, and I don't know if I had anyone else. Detective Rayburn was responsible for the scene investigation, so I know at least he went up there with me.
All right. And is that protocol normally to have at least the case agent or some other detective with you and a case agent walking around the scene? At least to not disturb it, I mean.
Yeah, we were outside of the crime scene tape, but typically, depending on the incident, we obviously wait for a search warrant. However, this was in a public hallway.
Okay.
So it was just a quick view of the scene from outside of the crime scene tape.
Oh, okay. So you did not actually cross over to where the body was at this point?
No,
Okay. All right. And what was the reason behind you going up there and just looking around a little bit?
because my next assignment or my next task was going to be to begin to interview witnesses. And I wanted to have a view of exactly what was up there in case when I'm speaking with someone, something strikes me that I might need to ask follow-up questions on.
Okay. Where was the defendant at this time?
My understanding was he was at the Superstition Patrol substation.
All right, had someone been with him and taken him over there and stayed with him the entire time?
Subsequent to my arrival at the scene and subsequent to that night, I found out that Sergeant Lean, according to his report, was assigned to be with Officer Brailsford.
All right, and how do you spell that sergeant's name? Sorry.
I believe it's Lien.
Okay. All right. So now, after you looked at the scene, you said you did interviews, is that correct?
Yes.
Who did you interview first?
The first person I interviewed was Monique Portillo.
All right. And before you interviewed her, did you get any further information about the 911 call?
Not other than what was at the briefing.
All right. And what was the reason behind interviewing Monique?
Monique was in the room with Mr. Shaver when officers went up to contact them.
Okay. How long was your interview with her approximately?
Just going from memory, I would say 10, maybe 15 minutes.
All right. Where did you interview her?
I interviewed her. We had a police vehicle in the parking lot, and she was in the vehicle.
Okay. Did you take her up back to the scene or back up to the 5th floor at all?
No, I did not.
All right. So you just talked to her while you're sitting in the cruiser. Did you audio record the interview?
Yes, I did.
All right. Did you also take notes at the same time?
I did not take notes. I just audio
Since
recorded it.
Right. And did you incorporate that by summary or otherwise into your report?
Yes, I did.
All right. Did Ms. Portillo say that Mr. Shaver ever threatened anybody with that rifle?
Excuse me, is she a witness that will be available at trial?
Yeah, he said the witnesses would.
I'm sorry.
He said that earlier, that the witnesses will be available for trial.
Well, I think he said that some of them would that were here today, but she's not here today. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, maybe I misheard.
Answer that then?
Is there,
He lives in Silver City, New Mexico.
is there an objection?
Yes, hearsay.
Okay. And you believe that there was no testimony that this witness would be available for trial?
I think hearsay is admissible at preliminary hearing if they lay the proper foundation. And since this witness lives in Silver City, New Mexico, I didn't, and maybe I missed it, but I didn't hear that foundation being laid for this particular witness. As to the other officers, I heard it laid, but I didn't hear it as to this one.
Ms. Charbel, did you want to ask that specific question about this specific witness?
Yes, sir. Were you able to contact Ms. Portillo?
Yes, I was.
And is she available and willing to testify?
Yes.
All right. So what was it?
The objection is overruled.
Sorry.
Can I
When did you talk to her?
ordeal the witness?
As to whether or not he contacted her and she's available for trial?
I suppose it would be more of a legal objection. Just because he contacted a witness out of state and she says I'm available for trial doesn't make her legally available for trial. She's not.
That's the definition, actually, of available for trial.
I would disagree with that as being a legal availability. In state, we have that power, but out of state, we do not have that power. That's my objection, Mark. So,
Okay, your objection is so noted. The objection's overruled. Ms. Charbel, you may ask your question.
Did she ever say that Mr. Shaver threatened anyone with the rifle?
No.
That he pointed at any people in particular?
No.
sorry, did I have the last question and answer read that? I didn't hear the question. I heard the answer.
Did he point the rifle at anyone in
the
particular?
court
I'm sorry.
reporter
Oh, I'm
will-
sorry, Judge. I thought he was asking.
That's okay.
The last question, did she say that Mr. Shaver threatened anyone with a rifle? Answer no. Question, that he pointed at any people in particular? Answer no.
Thank you.
How many people were in the room when the rifle was being handled?
3.
All right, and that would be herself, Mr. Shaver, and,
There was a third person, Luis, I believe his last name was Nunez.
all right, and did she say whether one or both of the males handled that rifle?
Both of them did.
All right, and did each of them point it out the window, as you said the 911 call had said?
Yes.
All right. Did she herself call 911 by any chance?
No, she did not.
All right, who was it that called? We don't need the name necessarily, but who was it in the hotel?
It was one of the employees of the hotel.
All right. All right, so now, Ms. Portillo is telling you what happened in that room, correct?
Correct.
Did she indicate to you Mr. Shaver's, whether he had been drinking, whether he was intoxicated, what her impression was at the time?
I do recall that she said that he had been drinking. I don't, at this point, recall if he said that she thought he was intoxicated, but she did state that he had been drinking.
All right, and did he make any kind of threats towards her? Or did he appear to be upset by anything as far as she told you?
No.
All right. Did you ask her about when the first time she realized that they needed to leave the room?
Yes.
And what did she say?
The first time that she realized they had been up in the room talking, Mr. Luis Nunez had already left the room. So it was Monique and Daniel were in the room, and it was when they received a call from the police on the hotel room phone.
All right. Was it your understanding, as this case developed later that night, that the officers or someone was trying to get their attention, hers and Mr. Shaver, earlier than the phone call?
Yes.
Did she indicate she ever heard anybody and was not willing to come outside?
No.
She did not hear anyone then hollering for them to come out?
No. Her first moment that she was aware that the police were outside was when they received the phone call in the room.
All right. And did they comply with the order to come out of the room?
Yes.
Okay. Did she tell you they were told why they were being asked to come out of the room?
No, she told me that Mr. Shaver had taken the call because he'd obviously been the one that rented the room. And then he informed her that the police were outside and that they needed to go outside.
Okay. Did you ask her any other questions at this time that are relevant that you remember?
I asked her what happened in the hallway because she went out with Mr. Shaver.
All right. And did she come outside first, did she say, or after him?
She came out first.
Okay. Did she take her possessions with her, her bag, her purse?
She did take a purse with her, yes.
All right. And so she walked out first and then he followed her, is that correct?
Yes.
All right. And since she was in front of him, could she see what he was doing?
At that point, she never described anything that he was doing as far as being able to see him now.
Okay. And then was she taken into custody, so to speak, first or after he was?
She was first.
Okay. After you interviewed her, what did you do?
After I interviewed her, I contacted my sergeant so that I could have Officer Brailsford brought to the scene for a walkthrough interview with him.
All right. When you were being briefed, were you told that that the defendant had a body camera basically attached to him?
At some point prior to his arrival, yes, I was told that.
All right. Were you told about any other officers who had also one of those body cameras that was at the scene?
At that time, the only body camera I knew was Officer Brailsford's. I subsequently learned that another officer had a body camera.
Okay. And so did you then ask that Officer Brailsford return to the scene with the camera?
Yes.
All right. And did he do so?
Yes, he did.
All right. Did somebody bring him or did he come by himself?
He was brought.
What did you do once he was there with his body camera?
The first thing I did is I took the body camera, and then myself, Detective Rayburn, Sergeant Gomez, who was assigned to the homicide unit at that time, we arranged for ourselves to view the body camera.
All right. And so you were not by yourself then when you watched it, correct?
Correct.
Right. And if you could tell us briefly how that camera works as far as being able to watch what happened, what it recorded, as much as you can, as you know about it.
My understanding, and I know very little about them, you have a camera piece, which is, I don't know, a little bit larger than a tube of chapstick. You have a battery pack, which is usually the thing that you see on the front of officers. Most of them wear it on the front. and then there's a cord that connects the camera to the battery pack. The actual recording is stored on the camera and not on the battery pack. And at the end of their shift or whenever they do it, there are docking stations at the substations where you plug the camera in and then the camera automatically downloads the videos into the video storage system.
Okay. Are the cameras turned on and off by the officers?
That's my understanding.
All right. Can they be turned on or off from somewhere else?
I don't know.
Okay. How were you able to watch it without you going to the station where everything was uploaded?
I guess there is some type of Bluetooth capability. I don't completely understand it, but I watched it on a cell phone through a feed. You have to have the camera within a certain proximity of the phone, and then I watched it on that phone.
So was it a regular size phone or was it a bigger than regular?
Phone.
Regular
I
size.
wasn't the best quality viewing, I would say.
Okay, that was going to be my next question, but were you able to see fairly well what was happening during the taping part?
You could see fairly well because it's a Bluetooth connection and it's wireless is my understanding of why it is. There are skips in the tape, like brief little skips as you're watching it.
All right. Did you at some later point in time watch that video again?
Yes, I did.
Have you watched it actually numerous times since this incident happened to write a report or to review it for court today?
Yes, I've watched it numerous times.
Okay. And would you summarize for us the contents of that video, just Mr. Brailsford, as you were watching it? And if you need to refer to your report, I have a copy of it.
Just as I was watching it at the scene that night, the video starts, as I recall, the camera was on Officer Brailsford's right shoulder. The audio doesn't turn on for about 30 seconds in the video. You can, obviously the camera is being moved, but you obviously can't see the officer because it's not pointed at the officer, but it starts with Officer Brailsford walking down the first floor hallway to the elevator that is on the west side of the building. Once he arrives at the west side elevator, I can see other officers on the video. A couple of them I know, a couple of them I don't know, so I can't say which one is which per se without watching it.
Stop you right there then. If I could have you run through the names of the officers and their sergeant who are involved in what happened, directly involved.
The people that were on the fifth floor when the incident occurred were Sergeant Langley, Officer Doan, Officer Elmore, Officer Gomez, Officer Cochran, and Officer Brailsford. Is that 6?
It is. And so would it be fair to say that Sergeant Langley was then in charge of this little operation at this time?
Yes.
Was there a K-9 officer as well?
Yes.
All right. Did he have the K-9 with him?
No.
All right. And in this situation, who makes the decision as far as which weapon which officer uses?
Typically in that situation, what they were trying to do was establish what's called an immediate action team, which is to address a situation where there may be a possible threat, and the sergeant would be in charge of deciding who does what on the immediate action team.
All right. And who decides which weapon in particular each person would use? Is that his decision or the officer's individual decision?
It can be the sergeant's decision or it can be the officer's decision depending on what the sergeant decides. Or if there wasn't a sergeant there, then the officers would obviously decide for themselves. Typically, whoever was in charge of doing the immediate action team, though, may assign people to use less lethal weapons, which obviously then he would be assigning some type
particular-
of tool
okay.
to use.
All right. Did Sergeant Langley assign anyone a less than lethal force
No,
at this point?
no.
All right, so no one was told, or not even the, whether it's one person or the whole group, that we're going to start off with less than lethal, and then if we need to, we can escalate that. Is that correct?
Sergeant Langley can be heard on the first floor on the video, explaining what their action plan is for arriving at the scene. A little while later, when they're on the fifth floor, you can hear him determining roles for people, such as he assigned someone to be a handcuffer.
Okay.
But as far as selecting a less lethal weapon and designating someone to deploy a less lethal weapon or have that particular tool available, he did not do that.
Okay. So what, as you're watching this, tape, you had already seen Mr. Shaver's body, is that correct? All right. What was Mr. Shaver wearing when he came out of the room?
He was wearing a dark T-shirt, basketball shorts, and you could see that he had I believe it was boxer shorts on.
Okay. So you could see his boxer shorts under the basketball shorts?
When I was in the hallway, yes, I could.
Was he wearing any shoes?
No,
All right. Did he have anything in his hands when he came out?
I could not see his hands.
Did the basketball shorts, were they loose? Were they big? Were they tight on him? Could you tell?
They appeared to be loose when he was laying on the ground. My recollection is that they were either at his knees or possibly a little bit below his knees at that point.
Okay. So as you're watching this tape and you were telling us that there was a briefing, what's the next thing that the officers do according to Mr. Brailsford's camera?
According to the camera, once Sergeant Langley determines what they're going to do when they reach the fifth floor, they all get into the elevator. There was one point where Officer Brailsford spoke to, I believe it was Officer Elmore, who also had a rifle, said that he had forgotten one of his magazines, and Officer Elmore gave him a magazine for one of the AR-15s, and then they all six rode up the elevator to the fifth floor.
All right. And what happened after they came out and got set up in their positions?
Once they came out, they advanced down the hallway to, the way the hallway is built is the doors are recessed into the hallway. So you have a straight hallway, and then you have a recessed, I don't know if you would call it a vestibule or what you would call it, where the doors to the room actually are. They advanced to that recessed vestibule directly to the east of the room where they were wishing to contact Mr. Shaver, where Mr. Shaver was in, and then they held on that position.
All right. So then at some point, did the sergeant start with a loud voice asking the people in 502 to come out?
Yes.
All right. And as we know, nobody came out at the time. Is that when the phone call was made by another officer?
You can actually hear, and I don't know which one it's more audible on Sergeant or Officer Doan's camera or Officer Brailsford's camera. You can hear Sergeant Langley speak with the officers who were behind him, telling them to go downstairs, call the room, and get a room key.
All right. Was Sergeant Langley using any kind of voice amplifier?
No.
He was just raising his voice and using his voice only, correct? All right. And as Ms. Portillo told you, he was not heard inside of that room. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And then at some point, did they come out, as you can see on the video?
Yes.
All right. And was Ms. Portillo correct? Did she come out first with her purse and walk up?
Yes.
All right. And then do you see Mr. Shaver come out as well?
Yes.
All right. Could you see his hands when he came out?
Yes. When you have to actually view Officer Brailsford's body camera in slow motion to see this, to discern this, but as Mr. Shaver is rounding the corner from his vestibule into the hallway, you can see his hands starting to go up into the air. And then as he rounds the corner, you can then hear Sergeant Langley audibly telling Ms. Portillo, who was ahead of Mr. Shaver, and Mr. Shaver to stop and get on the ground. And you can also see that Mr. Shaver is going down to his knees prior to him actually being told to go down to his knees.
Did both of them go prone on the ground where you can see their hands in front of them and everything?
They both eventually did go all the way down, and I believe that was from Sergeant Langley's additional commands to get down on the ground and lay down.
You know, as you're watching this video, did you see Mr. Shaver at any point make any threatening gestures towards the officers?
To that point,
Right.
no.
All right. As he's being told things, is he refusing? Is he saying, I'm not going to do this and that?
No.
Is he screaming at them or speaking loudly at the officers?
No.
Was he cursing at them or saying threatening things to them?
No.
Okay, nothing like, you know, I'm going to kill you or, you know, I'm going to get you guys or any of that nature?
No.
Did he appear to be upset, angry?
No.
All right. At some point, did he start crying?
Yes.
All right. Did he plead with the officers not to kill him? Did he say, please don't shoot me, please don't shoot?
Yes, he did.
And this was as what was happening with him?
Initially, once they came out of the room, Sergeant Langley had spoken to them and said that he thought that they had, that there was a failure to comprehend instructions. He then basically said that, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the exact quotes, but he said something to the effect that if they do not listen to what he's saying, that I believe it was at that point that he said that they may not survive. Then he proceeded to, Mr. Shaver had been laying on the ground. His hands were out in front of him. He was face down. He moved his hands back like this.
His chin?
Under his chin. And at that point, Sergeant Langley told him that he had not been told to move and to put his hands back out. Then he told him to place his hands on his head and interlace his fingers and to cross, and I don't remember which one, he said his right leg over his left or his left leg over his right, at which point it appeared that Mr. Shaver was confused. He crossed both legs back and forth a couple of times before finally crossing his legs. And at that point then, Sergeant Langley called Miss Portillo back to where the officers were standing so that she could be secured.
All right, so during this time, was Mr. Shaver doing or saying anything that would have, towards the officers, that would have caused them to believe that he was going to lunge at them?
No.
Did he reach, did he have anything in his hands that you can see?
No.
All right. How many officers were pointing weapons at Mr. Shaver at this point?
The only number that I can say for sure would be 2. And the only reason that I can say that is because at one point, Officer Brailsford, I think just prior to when he came out and also on Officer Doan's camera, Officer Doan was standing behind Officer Elmore. So Officer Elmore is visible in the hallway and pointing his weapon. And from Officer Brailsford's camera, he is also pointing his weapon. I did not see, and you can't see, for the most part, any of the other officers in the video.
All right, and so as far as you could tell for sure, there were 2 people with AR-15s pointing their weapons at Mr. Shaver and Miss Portillo.
Yes.
So she's taken out of the camera view, is that correct?
That's correct.
At one point, did one of the officers actually get in the line of fire and be in between the officers and Mr. Shaver?
Yes, he did.
Okay, and what was that about?
Miss Portillo had been asked to crawl back to where the officers were. She had crawled back to the position where the officers were, directly in front of where the officers, Officer Elmore and Officer Brailsford, had their rifles. And then he moved up to bring her back behind where the officers were to handcuff them, and he stepped in front of it appears he stepped in front of the muzzle of Officer Elmore.
So this officer, in particular, in this situation that was taken seriously by Sergeant Langley, actually turned his back on Mr. Shaver, is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Did anyone aside from the defendant fire their weapon at Mr. Shaver? Was there a point where one of the officers actually had a taser, which he did not fire as well?
That's correct.
And none of the other officers fired even a handgun towards him, correct?
That's correct.
At no point did was the canine brought up to in case they needed him, correct? Or her? Okay. Now, after you watched the video, did you finish it? Did you watch it to the end of right past the shooting, basically?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Did they go eventually into the room, some of the officers, to check the room?
Yes, they did.
Okay. Before they checked the room, as they're walking around, and later as the body was moved, Mr. Shaver's body, was there any weapon around that area?
No. And if I could just clarify.
Sure, sorry.
On the prior question, I know that they cleared the room from the 911 tape later and from a subsequent officer's body camera afterwards. However, that is not actually on the body camera video.
The clearing of the room?
That's correct.
Okay.
It's not on the video.
I got you. Okay. So it stopped as they approached the room past the body?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So were there any weapons found around or on Mr. Shaver's person?
No.
How about in the purse of the female? Ms.
No.
Portillo? All right. Anything that would have resembled a weapon, let's say, found around him that could have been mistaken for one?
No.
All right. Did Mr. Shaver ever put his hands inside of his pockets? No. All right. So what was the rifle that was eventually found in the room?
It was an airsoft rifle, I believe. I don't know. Airsoft might be a brand. It was some type of pellet pistol used for, I guess, varmint, pest control, something along those lines.
Okay. And so it was for his job that he was using it?
Yes, there were actually two in the room.
And they were both rifles? They were not handguns?
Both rifles, yes.
All right. And were there any weapons in his room that were not air rifles or some kind of a BB gun?
No firearms. I don't know if he had a knife or anything in the room, but no firearms.
And no firearms were found in there? Okay. And then later on, did you determine that the 911 caller had said it was a rifle? No mention of a gun, correct?
Yes.
All right. So now you have seen the video. Did you then just want to interview the defendant?
Yes.
All right. And is that protocol in an officer-involved shooting? Yes. Okay. Did he watch the video before you interviewed him? Just him?
There were other officers present, but he did watch the video with his attorney.
Okay. So he was able to watch it without you looking over his shoulder, for lack of a better word. You were not sitting there with him watching it, correct?
I was in the room, but I was not where I could see the video, no.
Okay. All right. And how many times did he watch it? Do you know?
Once,
Okay.
I believe.
All right. And after that, did you then sit down with him to do the interview?
I
stand?
gave him a moment, and then he let me know when he was ready, and then I interviewed him.
Okay. Where did you interview him?
On the 5th floor.
All right. But where on the 5th floor approximately?
It started when we exited the elevator on the west side of the building. I asked him to then begin to tell me, I started the interview at that point and basically walked him through the incident, and we ended when we were up at the crime scene tape, speaking about the end of the incident.
All right. If you would summarize for us what it was that he told you about the incident, since it was after he'd seen it.
Foundation, who was present?
Sorry.
Just objection, present, who was present, just foundation.
The objection to foundation is overruled. You can cover that on cross-examination, or Ms. Charbel can ask it now.
You said there were were there other people there when you were doing the interview and the walkthrough?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And were those individuals approved by either the Mesa Police Department or by Mr. Brailsford to be there?
Yes.
Okay. So did anyone else interfere? Did any of the other individuals interfere with your interview of him?
We had some questions asked by other individuals, but nobody interfered.
Tried to stop you from asking certain questions or stop you from doing your job of interviewing him, correct?
Correct.
All right. And so if you could summarize to us what he told you about the incident.
Officer Brailsford told me that when he arrived on scene, he was responding to an emergency call of a person with a gun. We had a brief discussion about what his prior calls had been that day, if they'd involved any arrests or use of force, or what his typical shift was and how long he worked there and things like that. Then it advanced into, I walked him down the hallway and asked him to tell me his impressions and what was occurring at each step. His body camera video from the time when it began until it ended was approximately 18 minutes. So I spoke with him about how they were going down the hall, what his assignment was, and then what had occurred when they exited the room.
Okay. And did he mention at that point feeling threatened or scared of Mr. Shaver as Mr. Shaver and Ms. Portillo came out of the room?
He said that there were several moments, or at least 2 moments, where he was terrified, that he did feel threatened by the movement that Mr. Shaver made right before he fired.
Did he happen to mention to you that Mr. Shaver was crying and asking not to be shot?
No, he did not.
How was he dressed, the defendant? What was he wearing?
He was wearing a Mesa Police Department uniform.
Okay. Did he have a bulletproof vest or any kind of body armor or anything of that nature?
Yes.
All right. And were the other officers dressed similarly?
Yes.
All right. So they all had body protection on? Is that pretty typical?
I would say most of them did. Obviously, some of them were wearing shirts where I don't recall, but it appeared that they all did.
And Mr. Shaver, however, was not, correct? He was wearing a T-shirt and some loose shorts. Is that right?
I don't remember if they were blue, but they were basketball
Loose.
shorts.
I'm sorry,
Or
not
loose,
blue.
yes. Yes, like basketball type athletic shorts.
All right. But Mr. Brailsford said that he was afraid of and felt threatened by Mr. Shaver, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And he did not mention anything about Mr. Shaver crying and asking not to be shot, correct?
No, not that I recall.
Now, Officer Doan, according to the reports, was the one who had a taser. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
All right. Did he fire that taser at any point?
No, he did not.
Right. And he never took out a weapon, correct? He talked only about having a taser. Is that right?
I don't recall specifically, but I thought he transitioned from a pistol to a taser prior to them coming out of the room or shortly thereafter.
Okay. So this Officer Doan actually went down one step from lethal to non-lethal. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And he was one of the officers who was there, right? Did Officer Doan say he was afraid of Mr. Shaver?
He did not say he was afraid. It's not specified in his report as far as I can recall.
Did he say he felt threatened by Mr. Shaver at any point?
No.
All right. Did he mention that Mr. Shaver was crying and asking to not be shot?
No, he did not.
All right. How about Officer Elmore?
I didn't, could you read her question back? I hear his answers clearly, but I don't hear counsel's questions clearly. Sorry.
Was all right. Did he mention that Mr. Shaver was crying, asking not to be shot? And the answer was no, he did not.
Thank you.
Speak up, sorry. All right, what about Officer Elmore? Did he say he was afraid of Mr. Shaver?
He did not use that word. I'm paraphrasing, but I believe he used something along the lines of he perceived a threat.
From Mr. Shaver, correct?
Yes.
But he did not fire his weapon at Mr. Shaver. Did he mention Mr. Shaver was crying and asking not to be shot?
No, he did not.
All right, and these officers wrote supplements to, reports, basically, correct?
Yes,
Did any of them mention the fact that Mr. Shaver was crying and asking to not be shot? All right. How about Officer Gomez? Did he mention being afraid of Mr. Shaver?
no,
Feeling threatened in any way by Mr. Shaver?
no,
Did he fire his weapon?
no, he did not.
And what about Sergeant Langley? Do you know if he had a weapon pointed at Mr. Shaver?
I do not know.
All right. Did he say or write in his report that he was afraid of Mr. Shaver?
He said that he perceived a threat and Mr. Shaver's motion was an attempt to reach a handgun.
Did Sergeant Langley mention Mr. Shaver was crying and asking to not be shot?
No,
All right. And he did not fire any weapon or any taser or anything at Mr. Shaver, is that correct?
that's correct.
Now, when you watch the tape, you know, the video, and you're watching the commands being given for Ms. Portillo as well, but for Mr. Shaver, let's say in particular, that he crawled towards the officers, is that normally how these situations are handled? Do you ask a suspect to approach as an officer?
Could I have the question be read? I cannot, I just can't hear it.
Counsel, please approach. Take a 5-minute recess.
All right.
Test them out and see if it helps.
Thank you, Judge. All right, Detective, before we took our break, I had asked you if that was how it's supposed to be done, protocol, to have a suspect who is a threat crawl towards you as an officer.
You would sometimes have suspects approach you, but the tactic of having someone crawl towards you in the manner that I observed in the video was nothing that I've ever been trained or observed.
All right. Was, from viewing the tape and talking, especially from seeing it yourself, was there anything impeding any of the officers from walking up to Mr. Shaver when he was prone on the ground?
Not that I could see, no.
All right. And so they were all armed and there was nothing physically stopping them from approaching him and putting handcuffs on him when he was down, correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to take you back briefly to what you said about the briefing that you received. In the briefing, what was described to you as Mr. Shaver's action was non-compliant. After watching the video, was that your impression, was that he was being non-compliant with the orders?
In the time that I watched the video, I don't necessarily like the word compliant or non-compliant, in that suggests that he followed every order exactly as it was given. However, I did not see what I would term as a non-compliant act. What I observed Mr. Shaver to be doing appeared to me to be compliant, although somewhat confused at times as to the instructions that he was being given.
All right. And again, during this entire time, up until the moment he was shot, did he ever say anything threatening to the officers?
No,
Did he ever wave anything at them that could have been misconstrued even as a weapon?
no,
Did he even point at them simulating a weapon with his fingers like children do?
no.
All right. Was Mr. Shaver told at any point why he was being asked to come out of that room?
No.
When they called him, could he have been asked about a weapon? Hey, do you have a weapon in that room? Or we got a call that there was a weapon in that room?
Objection, conjecture.
Sustained.
Was there anything stopping the officers from asking any questions they wanted of him? Let's just make it in general terms.
Objection as to what time, what are you talking about?
Sorry. When they called?
When they called up to the room? No, I mean, they obviously, if they were on the phone, they could have delivered any message. I obviously do not have firsthand knowledge, and it's obviously not on the tape of exactly what the exchange was on the phone, so I don't know if they did or they didn't either.
All right. But according to the police reports that you read in the interviews, did anyone explain to him why he was being asked to come out?
Not that I know of, no.
All right. And when he was out, right, and the sergeant was talking to him, was he asked at any point about a weapon?
No, he was not, that I recall.
Okay. Nobody asked him, hey, do you have a weapon on you? What's in your pockets? Empty them out? Any of that business?
There was nothing like that, no.
All right. And the female, Miss Portillo, she was carrying a big purse, right? It was kind of rather large purse. Looked like it was full of things. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Did they ask her about any weapons in there?
No.
All right. And in fact, when she was arrested, they left her purse right in front of Mr. Shaver. Is that correct? I mean, in front of him, not directly, but on the floor ahead of him.
It was in front of him.
All right. And so nobody went to get that, correct?
Correct.
Or look into it to see if it had any weapons in it.
Correct.
All right. And yet the impression that you got from Mr. Brailsford and the sergeant was that they felt that there was a threat coming from Mr. Shaver, correct?
Objection irrelevant.
Can you read the question again?
I said, and yet the Mr. Brailsford and the sergeant said that they felt threatened by Mr. Shaver.
The objection's overruled. I'll allow it.
I'm sorry, I didn't object to that question. She asked a different question to which I objected. I don't object to that question.
Okay, that's my question.
I'm sorry, I need to know what the question is again.
All right, the question was, despite the fact that nobody looked in the bag, right? Mr. Brailsford and Sergeant Langley both said that they felt threatened by Mr. Shaver, correct?
Sergeant Langley wrote in his report, he perceived a threat.
Okay,
Officer Brailsford told me that he perceived that same threat and that he was terrified by it.
okay. And now, until you interviewed the defendant, Mr. Brailsford, you don't know who he spoke to before you got to him, correct?
That's correct.
You don't know what he did up until the time that you talked to him, correct?
That's correct.
Is that true of the other officers and detectives also at the scene?
That's correct. The other officers wrote a supplemental report to the incident, and I did not speak with them or interview them because they were completing a supplemental report.
Okay, so they wrote their own reports of what happened.
That's correct.
All right, we talked a little bit about that earlier. If I may approach, Your Honor. When, at some point, did you, I don't know if that's the right word, but did you burn or make a copy of what was on Mr. Brailsford's body camera?
I made copies for the county attorney's office.
Okay. What happened to the original, so to speak?
The original was downloaded from the camera into the police department's video system that stores those.
Okay.
I don't know exactly what the official name of that storage unit is, but it's downloaded into there.
All right, so it's not like a regular camera where it ends up on a disk and that disk itself is the original that's stored somewhere. It's actually a machine that stores it and then you can burn a disk from that, is that correct?
Yes, and I actually didn't, because the video was restricted so that other officers couldn't view it, I actually had to contact the administrators of the video system, and they provided me a digital copy of the video in order to then burn for the county attorney's office or view.
Okay. We had talked earlier briefly about the other officer, Officer Doan, I believe, who also had a camera. Is that who it was?
Yes,
Okay. And did you watch that view as well?
yes, I did.
Did you watch it that night or at a later date?
I didn't realize that Officer Doan had a camera probably until a week later, so I can't specify an exact date of when I watched it, but it would be approximately a week later.
Okay.